welcome to the Wormhole Podcast, episode 64. I'm Charlie Place, and joining me today is a debut author whose dystopian novel covers a society restricted for women. Released last month, it is one of the best novels I've read full stop. Honestly, exceptional writing, exceptional storytelling and allegory. If it does not win many or any awards in the next couple of years, I will be calling shenanigans. Hello, Chloe Timms.
Hello, Charlie. Thank you so much. What an introduction that is.
Oh, I mean every word. It's been absolute pleasure to read your book. But I suppose I need to start with, how are you?
Yeah, I'm great, thank you. I mean, even better now I've heard you lavish this praise on me. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm going to start with something different, but I think you'll be all right with it. You say on your blog that you will mention the Bridport Prize for Poetry longlisting at every opportunity. So I've done the intro here. Can you tell us about it?
Yes, so I can't remember what year it was. I'm going to say it was about 2015. I entered the Bridport Poetry Prize, and I'll say it now, I'm not a poet, and my teachers at school would have told you I have absolutely no musicality. In fact, music was my worst subject at school. But I had written a poem for, I think it was an Open University course, and I was quite proud of this poem. But then I was at a very early stage in my career, and I just sort of thought, oh, we'll see how it goes, or I'll enter a competition or two. So I entered the Bridport Prize, having no idea what an important prize it was, really. And then I got longlisted for this poem, and I still to this day think, wow, what an achievement, because I was completely a novice in terms of my writing career. So to be longlisted at that point was nothing short of a miracle, really. So yes, very proud of that.
So, I mean, does that mean you do or you don't have a poetry collection in you?
Oh, definitely not. There's no way I'm a poet. I have to say I'm not even someone that really reads poetry, because I just feel like I don't understand it enough to appreciate it. So no, probably not a poetry collection in me.
Fair enough. And at the same time, damn it, because I would very much enjoy reading it.
Well, you never say never, you know.
Good. Yeah, I'll keep thinking that in my mind. You interview on your podcast, which we'll talk about in full later. But one question you ask authors, I've noticed, is how they find their agent. Can you tell us your own story?
Yeah, so I feel a bit of a cheat when it comes to how I got my agent, because I didn't do all the horrible thing of querying loads of agents and waiting for a response. So I won a scholarship for the Faber Academy Write Your Novel course, which was a 6-month course in 2018. And once you've done that course, they have an agents day where they invite loads of agents to the premises, and you read an extract of your work. And also they get a printed anthology, which is this blockbuster of a book, which has got everyone's, usually their first chapter in. And that book is sent out to a majority of agents in London and around the country, usually kind of big names, and they read it, hopefully, and potentially pick people that they like the sound of. Well, the day that anthology went out, I got an email from Nell Andrew, who is now my agent, and she said she always starts at the back of the book because she figures that most people start at the beginning. And because I'm a letter T surname, she found me and loved my opening chapter and decided to, well, she didn't offer me representation immediately, but she was interested enough that she wanted a conversation, and we had a telephone chat, and I kind of said to her, look, I haven't actually finished the book yet, but I'd be happy to stay in touch. And she really was very, very keen and didn't really mind that I hadn't written the whole book, but I didn't want to promise that I was going to deliver this incredible manuscript and then fail to deliver it. So that was in September 2018. And then I did wait a while, and then it got to March 2019, and friends of mine were saying, what's happening? Have you spoken to Nell again? And I said, no, I feel like I'm not ready. And they were like, what are you talking about? Mm-hmm. So I emailed her and sent her 5 chapters and just crossed my fingers and hoped she wouldn't hate it. And I think she was at London Book Fair at the time. And she said to me, I'll get back to you by the end of the week. And less than 24 hours later, she got back to me and said, I absolutely love it. I was worried that perhaps it wasn't ready, but she was so thrilled with it. She invited me to her office and we had a chat, and she offered me representation there and then. So it's been an incredible journey, and I'm absolutely thrilled with Nell. She's an amazing agent.
Ah, wonderful. That's a wonderful story. And it's really cool that she starts at the back of the book. That is really cool. Yeah. So listeners, The Seawomen is set sometime in our collective future on the Isle of Eden. It's a place away from the horrors of the Otherlands. On Eden, women must avert their eyes from the sea lest they be taken in by the beautiful Seawomen who are there to pull them into sin. Only the men are safe to fish and control the harbour. When a woman is of age, she's married off, and then when the elder mothers decree it, she will have a year to fall pregnant. If she does not fall pregnant, she'll be cast into the sea because she's been taken over by evil. Our story is told by Esta, who lost her parents in circumstances that have always seemed too simplified. She is, one day, chased by a group of young men and runs into the sea for safety. Chloe, shall we start with your reading?
Yes, there's a prologue in my novel, but I'm going to read from the first chapter. Picture the island now, and what do I see? A grey day, the wind crackling, the gulls crying, the land, a turret, rising high out of the wild sea. The top of the island, the northern edge, lost in mist. The chapel, the church, the harbour, the peat moors, the knitters and the milkers, the gutter women with their knives, fish juices and seawater running up to their elbows. Women clutching their crosses, looking down at their feet, praying for the Lord's protection. They've heard the rumours. They had an inkling all along. The bells of a Sunday service ringing out past the gust-wrecked croft houses, through the fields as the wild sheep chase each other as far as the heather in the north, to the stretches of the island that are worn and crumbled, once ours but claimed by the sea now. I picture the past, her cottage, where it all began. What would I change? What good is change? It's too late for that now. It's too late for anything. This island is built on stories, tales, lore, lies. They have their reasons to while away the hours, to hide the truth, to soften, to reassure, to explain, to warn, to scare. Everyone on this island has a story, and this is mine. I am 3 years old, struggling to keep up with her. We were walking there to her cottage on a southeasterly point of the island, a downward slope where the land was carpeted in green and pitted with holes made by field mice and puffins. Around the cottage was a scruff of nettles, a low mist rolling off the spine of the sea. We were caught in the middle of a downpour, a squall of it coming straight from the west, rain so cold it made me forget I was made of flesh and blood. So fast I lost my vision. We were laden with bags and boxes. Nothing in them belonged to me. Everything inside was given in sympathy. Wooden blocks, knitted dolls, clothes that other children had outgrown, dresses that would take months to fit me. A large bonnet that had been made especially to cover my scars. We were running for shelter, the horizontal sheets of rain making everything a murky silver. Everything that had once been mine was ash. We stood under the overhang of the white cottage, shaking off the wet, my teeth rattling pebbles. Sal was her name, my grandmother. I'd like to sever her from my story, but I can't. Our blood is tied. My story is hers. Everything I am started with her in that damp cottage. I stared at the blue door, painted for God's appreciation, a cross above it. All the houses across the stretch of the island carried crosses and wreaths, all a message to God for protection and a warning to the sea and the women within it. Stay back. Once inside, she took a breath and roughly pulled my coat off my shoulders. There, nothing wrong with a bit of rain. I would soon learn that she was the type of woman that didn't own an umbrella. If it rained, God meant for us to get wet. Nothing happened on Eden's Isle that wasn't God's doing. In the cold, my nose started to run, but I was too afraid to move and wipe it. My grandmother's rain-wet fingers stilled my chin. Now, you're here, and it's time to be brave, isn't it? You're not a baby anymore, Esta. I was old enough to realise something was missing, something was wrong. You're not a baby anymore. She'd said that before. I had a memory of it. Somewhere else, another time, after the fire, after the doctor, after the screaming, my cheek waxy, weeping, red, raw, prodded, thick with bandages. Are you listening? Don't sniff. She didn't use the word dead, or anything like it. She just told me my parents were gone. Not once did she look like she might cry. that she missed her only daughter. It's just the two of us now. You live here with me. You understand? Right here in this cottage. You have a room and a bed, and I have mine, and you aren't to disturb me. Yes? I nodded or blinked. I can't remember if any words left my mouth or if I even understood her, but I understood enough to follow her further into the cottage as she told me every rule I could not break, every blessing we needed to give.
Thank you. So I think this question is probably completely expected, but can you tell us about the starting point of this novel, the idea, the inspirations, etc.?
Yeah, so again, I've said I'm not a poet, but weirdly, this did start as a poem. I did a short course, a distance learning course with Esta University, and one of the modules was on poetry. And I can't even remember what that seed of idea was in terms of the idea for the poem, but I knew I had this vision of a woman standing on a coastline and a man emerging from the water and her falling for him, but not being able to get to him. And there's that barrier between them because she couldn't swim. And it was an idea that after that point of writing it, it kind of obsessed me. It kept coming back into my mind. And I knew I wanted to do more with it. As I said, I'm not a poet, so I knew I wanted to turn it into a story or something. So I started writing this short story, and elements of dystopia began to come into it, I guess. I'd always been a huge fan of The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. I'd read it at school, and it totally transformed my idea of what fiction could do and what literature was. And I just loved the whole world building of building a really horrendous regime. And so I started writing this short story where there was a horrendous regime and very strict control. And I remember showing it to one of my tutors when I was doing my creative writing masters at Kent University, and they said to me, this is far too big for a short story in terms of the scale of what you're trying to do, and I think you need to write a novel. And I was just kind of horrified by the thought that I might have to write something that was 100,000 words, but I was so enamored by this idea and this world that was forming in my mind that I just decided to give it a go. And initially the story was very different, and it was from another character's point of view. But the more I worked on it, I realized that Esta's story was the one that I wanted to tell and the one that was the most important to me. And I think, as with many writers, things that occupy your mind, whether consciously or subconsciously, do tend to form or leak into your ideas. And I am a disabled woman, and I always think perhaps things like the barriers in my own life and the obstacles that I face do creep into my work. And so I think I naturally write about people who are restricted in some way or outsiders in some way. And I was thinking more recently about, obviously swimming takes a huge part in this novel. And there was a point where I could swim, and I won a trophy for my swimming, but I've now reached the point and my condition has progressed to the point that I can't swim anymore. I wonder now whether that has filtered into some of Esta's quest for freedom, really. But I would say the idea has evolved and it's kind of changed a lot over the process. And I unfortunately didn't have that kind of light bulb moment that many writers seem to have, but I think it's come together more gradually and hopefully developed in a satisfying way as well.
I've got loads of follow-up questions here. Let's start with one. So early on you said about Esta herself and the dream that you had and the thoughts there. In your opinion, obviously, is Esta important for herself or more for what she represents?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think, to me, obviously, she's the heart of the story. And even though earlier drafts, as I mentioned, she wasn't the main character, it's always been her story. So for me, she is very important in herself. I think in terms of the story, what she represents, and I know we're going to touch on spoilers later on in the podcast, she is very much the seed of change in this novel. And I hope what readers will get from it is that change comes slowly, but you need a match to ignite it. And I think Esta is very much that person in the story. She's the sort of person that you hope in 10, 20 years' time will have inspired change on the island and hopefully a takedown of the regime. So it's difficult to say. I think what she represents is a huge part of the story, but I think she herself is the heart of it. And so to me, her character is just as important.
Is there any significance with her name?
Do you know what? She's one of the only characters whose name never changed. And I think often writers will head to babynames.com or something to scroll through hundreds and thousands of names to find out what their characters are going to be called. But sometimes names just fit, and Esta fitted for me. There is discussion in the novel about the meaning of her name, and I think in some languages Esta means star, and Esta felt hurt to begin with, thinking that her mother picked a name that felt so far away when she knew she was trapped in a place she couldn't move from. But I've always thought of it as Esta's mother picking a name that gave her the opportunity to be further than she was. But again, that came later when I looked into kind of meanings of names. I didn't pick that name because of its meaning. It felt right. And it's a strange feeling when you just come across a name that just sits in your mind and you think, yes, that's the name.
That's good to get your answer. I know when I started, I mean, obviously I'd seen the blurbs and the basic plot before I started the book. But I know when I got to a few pages in, I started to cotton on to what you were doing. I did wonder if there was something biblical about it, the Esther in the Bible and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no Bible expert. Obviously, there's a lot of religious elements to the novel, and there are religious names throughout. And I was conscious of picking certain names anyway, of having kind of a biblical influence. But no, the name came before any further thought towards any deeper meaning, actually.
Now, you also said about another character. Is this something to do with the major structural change that you talk about that you had after starting work with your editor?
Actually, the major change, the novel has gone through kind of many, many cycles. So I started writing a version of the novel in 2016, and by 2018, I realized it wasn't working. So originally, the story was from the point of view of Esta's son coming back to the island. The story was very different. So at that point, Esta was an old woman in like a nursing home, and he would then discover his origins and this kind of the secrets of the family and why they were so outcast. So it was an incredibly different novel. But the more I wrote, the more I thought the story is in the past. The story is Esta's story. And it just felt right to tell it from her point of view. So yeah, the major structural change, which happened with my editor, was with a version that I'd started writing in 2018, which was from Esta's point of view. And the structural change was that originally there were alternating chapters, and there were some chapters set where Esther's imprisoned, and then we go back to her past. But my editor felt, and I completely agree with them, that the story worked better if we were on Esther's journey with her and we didn't find out what had happened until the end, rather than knowing that she was imprisoned right from the start.
Mm-hmm. No, it sounds the right thing. And I mean, while this book does not need a sequel, if you wanted one, you've kind of got a seed of an idea there, definitely, yeah.
Well, I know some readers have been asking me about sequels, and I don't have any plans to, but I'm happy for people to tell me how they would like a sequel to go, or what their interpretation of the ending. I'm always fascinated to hear what people think about what's going to happen next. I suppose that's kind of fascinating for me to hear.
Well, I'm going to ask you your own opinion on that later. So that's something to look. I'm going to look forward to that, definitely. So I think we can move on to this, and hopefully it all comes together. Why mermaids and selkies?
I, hand on heart, can't say for definite, but I have always been obsessed with mermaids since I was a child. Like, my favorite Disney film was The Little Mermaid. I went through a phase as a child of just drawing mermaids' tales in oceans over and over and over and over. My mum went to art college, and she wouldn't define herself as particularly artistic now, but she is very good. She is a very good artist. And when I was a child, I would be like, Mum, teach me how to draw this. And I remember she showed me how to kind of basically draw a mermaid's tail disappearing into the water. And I just got obsessed with drawing mermaids. And one of the weird things I used to do was to cut out images of women in bikinis from catalogues and then stick that on a bit of paper and draw their tail and draw their head. And I don't know whether I've kept any or whether my parents have kept any of these drawings, but mermaids was like, as every child has, a fixation. That was my fixation for a long time. And then probably throughout my teenage years, it wasn't still in a mermaid phase. I'd probably grown out of it by then, but I live by the sea and I've always lived by the sea. And so the sea is kind of a natural thing to filter into my work. And because I think the story idea started with Cal emerging from the water, I'd always kind of been drawn to this idea of other creatures. And I think somewhere still that childhood fascination with mermaids had lurked. And I think there's so much fascinating folklore and myth about sea creatures and selkies and sirens out there that I just knew that there was going to be so much to explore in terms of my research. And I am very fortunate to have a endorsement on the front cover of my book from Kirsty Logan, who's a writer I absolutely adore. And she has written about selkies and it's kind of similar sea creatures in her work and very much leans towards folklore and fairy tale and mythology. And the more I read work like that, I thought, okay, it's possible for me to put a bit of, I guess, fantastical into my writing. Whereas before, I think maybe I would have been a bit too afraid to mix genres in that way. But I felt like they added something to the story. It's not strictly a mermaid story, but I kind of love the idea of myth and that being tied in with fear and stories spread on the island, really. So that's where they started.
Well, the first kind of what if question then, you had lots of possibilities. I know from a reader, I can see I was thinking, okay, so maybe the Seawomen aren't real, or maybe they're going to come in and change everything, perhaps along with the women who had been untethered. You know, these women might have been saved.
Yeah.
Is the way that you incorporated the Seawomen and what they meant and how they were involved, was that always the plan from when you got this idea?
I think with anyone that does like a lot of world building and any kind of imagination in terms of their setting or any sort of fantasy type of writing, you have to do a lot of work when it comes to logic and creating this world. And so I'd done a lot of that in early drafts where I kind of was working out for myself, I suppose, what the Seawomen were. They weren't originally an all-female species, and I had to kind of work out almost the logic of why they existed, how they existed. Like you say, were they real? Were they just a ploy to control women? And I did a lot of the working out and the logic, and I've probably written thousands of words just for myself to explain their existence and things that won't fit into the book, but just almost so I had their own mythology in my mind while I was writing. So hopefully it all makes sense and I didn't have to over explain things. But I think with everything, when you approach writing, things change and develop over time, and ideas I had at the beginning, then I would write and wouldn't necessarily work, or there were certain elements that I always knew were the same. So I always had this idea that the Seawomen would exist around this island, and it's essentially like colonization. So the humans would come to the island and want to take it over and get rid of the Seawomen who were the natives, I suppose, to the sea and the area around the island. So that element has always been the same, and that touches on the Festival of the Land, where the islanders celebrate their victory over the Seawomen and their kind of banishment from the sea. And I'd written a lot more in the past about kind of songs and more stories that were more about the islanders torturing the Seawomen and portraying them as these horrendous evil beasts that they'd had victory over. But obviously not all of it makes the final cut when you write your book, but you have to, if you're doing world building, you have to kind of build the mythology in your own mind and perhaps write thousands and thousands of words that don't eventually make the cut, but they help you to create this world to make it real for yourself.
No, I was thrilled that they were a real thing. I thought that was brilliant, because I'd got used to the idea that they might not be real for so long, and then you brought them in and it was brilliant.
Thank you.
Did you consider having the women who are untethered being saved at all, or were they always going to be not around effectively?
Yeah, that was a discussion. I worked with a brilliant editor called Sally OJ, who I had a mentoring, I think it was a year-long mentoring with, that I'd won in a competition with the literary consultancy. And I think perhaps my tastes in fiction are a lot darker than hers. And so certain suggestions she had were the women being saved, and I was very much like, nope, that's it, they're dead, they're gone. And it's probably something that maybe I've crushed on the readers' dreams now. Maybe some readers were hoping that they were still alive out there, but for me, it goes hand in hand with the brutality of the place, and it wouldn't feel right to me for them to be alive somewhere. And I think I would hope that the island and the regime wouldn't have lasted if these women that had been untethered were still out there somewhere. I'd like to think that they would have done something about it. So that was definitely a possibility, but not my choice, I suppose.
No, it's a good point. And I mean, it is a difficult thing to consider and read about as a reader, but it's also profound. It is. It works in your story. I thought it was really interesting that, albeit that it's only one man in this book, you have a man that is the reason, effectively, in quotes, for Esta's understanding and development. And I did think it might be the Seawomen. Can you talk about your use of Cal here, you know, how he came to be kind of the defining moment of that point of the book, effectively?
Cal and Esta's relationship was always the linchpin of the story. And as I mentioned, that was the first idea I had of this kind of forbidden love, this impossible love, a tragic love story where two people are desperate to be together but are prevented from being so. And so Cal and Esta they've always been the central point. I think the story grew much bigger than them, and obviously grew to so much world building that I initially hadn't considered. I was very reluctant to have this idea of, you know, the man saving the woman and Cal rescuing Esta as such, because I just didn't want to tell that story. And so I tried to tell a story where Esta is very much, she needs Cal to see the world in a different way, but he is not the reason that she's already started having that journey before she met him. And he does represent her journey in learning about who she is in the wider world. But I think obviously he represents a lot more to her, because he is that kind of taste of freedom that she's also always longed for. Cal's another character who, again, I had to do a lot of work on that didn't make the book. And because we only see him through Esta's eyes, we are limited to kind of the conversations that they have. And I didn't want Cal to have to reel off a list of facts about where he'd come from and where he lives or things like that. So I had to find ways that Esta could naturally be curious about who he was and his life. So Cal's been there from the start. He's obviously developed, but their love story was really important for me to show Esta's exploration of what freedom was and her independence, and also learning about the wider world.
No, I'm loving learning all this from you, getting all perspectives of the author. Obviously, it's really lovely, and I will go back to Cal soon later for more of your interpretations, actually. But I wanted to ask, your writing, you know, the narrative is amazing, it's spectacular, as I know I've said, but I love your use of tense, and you've got this distance between Esta and her story. On this, can I ask, when in Esta's life, roughly, is this being written? If you want to answer that, however you'd like to answer that question.
Oh, okay. So for me, it's written in a sort of her brain, I suppose, while she's in prison. So as I mentioned originally, the way the story was originally structured, Esta was telling herself this story as a way to remember herself in a way that she wanted to be remembered. She didn't want her final moments to be the version of her life that Father Jessup would deliver at her untethering. So originally that was how it was structured. Earlier versions of the story, the novel was actually present tense, and we were very much learning Esta's discovery of the world as it happened. But I found it was too difficult to I don't think it was a very pleasant reading experience to read her very much indoctrinated into this world. I felt it really needed her to have already learnt about the world and have her, the scales fall from her eyes. So the perspective changed in that way. But yes, I see it as a way for Esta to reclaim her story.
Yeah, no, I do like that you use that, how you've written it, and it definitely gives you as the reader, you know that there's going to be better out there and stuff, which is very nice. It's less frustrating and stuff like that. So, again, this is back to interpretations and your own opinion. What are the Otherlands to you? What are they like?
Well, the island itself, even though I had a long period of pushback, speaking with various different editors and critique partners, where I was very reluctant to ground the island in reality and base it on a real place. But I won't say exactly where it's based, but it is based on a real place. And perhaps readers, if they read it, will roughly work out where it's based. And to me, I actually, from my perspective, don't think the Otherlands are as horrific and warped as Father Jessup would lead his followers to believe. But there's obviously an allowance that they make. They know certain things are going on this island and they let it go. That there's parts of the novel where I say that the seas are very polluted and the Otherlands are so deprived of fish and kind of quality in that sense that they will, overlook the atrocities that are going on Eden's Isle to get their fish, to get the imports that they truly want, which I guess is how we operate in the world now. If we want certain things, be it oil or whatever, we overlook the certain countries' behavior or torture and things like that, the things they do to their own citizens. So obviously we're talking about a future, but I guess I saw it as a world moved on and perhaps morally very different from what Father Jessup would hope for his islanders, which is why they moved there in the first place. So probably not as extreme as he would make out, but I didn't think too much about the Otherlanders or the Otherlands because I knew I wouldn't be writing about them as such. We know from the novel that Father Jessup would visit them, and he claimed to be going there to be able to report back on how horrendous their lives were and how depraved. But actually, we know he was going there to sleep with women and probably have a great time on these other islands to kind of show his hypocrisy as a leader, really.
Mm-hmm. Get an idea of Father Jessup early on with what you're saying. But yeah, that was like, definitely what's going on there. So you mentioned Father Jessup. There's lots of men in this book. Some of them are kind of more of the government sort of group. And then there's a lot of them that are just bog standard regular citizens. Mm-hmm. And I suppose I want to kind of look specifically at them in this question. Can you talk about the importance of having most of these kind of regular men in the dark too, or are they indeed in the dark?
Oh, I think they're totally complicit in what's going on. And I don't really think that they are in the dark in terms of they're fully going along with what's happening. Whether they go along with it because they believe it 100% or whether it's because it's convenient for them to believe it. As men, they don't face much hardship. I don't know. And I think it's the environment, the society that they're in, there isn't really opportunity, or in their eyes, there wouldn't really be opportunity for them to rise up because they would just be punished or tortured. I mean, we know from what happened to Barrett. I mean, his character is incredibly complex because I don't know how you felt at the end of the book, but it's hard, and I know Esta feels the same. It's hard to justify what he knows to be true, and yet he's still lived on that island and said nothing. I mean, he knows that he wouldn't be believed, and he doesn't want the reputation of his wife to be tarnished, but he has sat back and watched women drown over something he knows is completely false. So I hope that readers will be questioning themselves, do you forgive Barrett? Do you not? And probably the same with several other characters. They do things that are, in their eyes, the right thing to do, but it does cause the harm and the death of other characters. And I think there are a lot of characters in this book that are incredibly morally grey and would possibly cause debate. And certain people I know, that even me and my editor had deep discussions about Mull and whether she deserved forgiveness at the end. So I think men and women in this book are complicit in what's going on and will hopefully provoke debate.
Well, I'm going to have to ask briefly, should Mull be forgiven in your opinion?
Oh, I don't know. It's a tough one, isn't it? Because of who she is. She's Father Jessup's daughter, his only daughter. She faces a huge burden on her shoulders of being his only daughter. And perhaps she thinks she was doing the right thing. I think there's an element of vindictiveness possibly, but I think, she has her eyes opened at the end of the book, and my hope is that people will see that there's been a moment of change in her, which will hopefully lead to a better future. I'd like to say there's an element of forgiveness there, but whether people feel the same, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. I would like to kind of see her beyond your pages rise up, but
definitely
her position makes that difficult, definitely.
Yeah.
So, and you said about Barrett and what he knows and he hasn't done anything, which is nicely contrasted with Nora, who knows stuff and obviously can't do anything. Yeah, I'm seeing that more and more as we're talking, and then seeing that contrast, which is lovely. I'd like to briefly ask about the grandmother. Can you talk about the grandmother? She is supportive of the island, but she could also fear it. Where does she fit for you in terms of her belief and what's going on?
Well, first of all, Sal, the grandmother, I love as a character. And the funny thing is, in an earlier version of this novel, she was dead. And so we only saw her in kind of very small fragments of Esta's memory. And I remember my writing group at Faber kept giving me feedback going, we love the grandmother, more of the grandmother. And so in the end, when I went back in time and started writing Esta from an earlier age, she was inevitably there more, and we explored. Well, actually, my agent was reading versions of my novel, and she was more than happy to go back in time and start at the beginning of Esta's story, and absolutely loved the relationship that Esta and Sal have. And Sal is a true believer. She's very much, if you cut her open, she bleeds the island, because she's so much a fan of Father Jessup's work and believes, and she's very, very fearful of everything he's implanted in her. And she's a very pious woman. She will be just at the window, terrified of what's to come. I think, again, she's another character that is someone that's incredibly morally grey. So obviously we know that she was more than happy to watch her entire family burn, and because she believed that what she was doing was to save them all, I guess, not them, but the island. And she puts the island above her whole family. She believed her daughter was under the influence of the Seawomen, and so Father Jessup told her that the way to rid them all of this curse was that if they all died, and she went along with it. But then obviously we know had a change of heart, went back for Esta, and so it's very much her not wanting Esta to fall down that path. And I know she sees it in Esta and is so desperate for her not to follow her mother's path. And obviously her death is a huge turning point for Esta, because she's finally able to live a little bit more like she wants to. But of course Esta does blame herself partly for her grandmother's death, and believes and starts to wonder whether she's kind of right, and whether she is cursed, and whether it's something within her that's cursed from day one. But yes, I very much enjoyed writing Sal's character, and I've said before in other interviews that my favourite characters, really, apart from Esta, to write are characters like Father Jessup and Sal, who have quite a nasty edge to them, but for some reason I really enjoy writing them.
Well, they're important to the story, aren't they, and what you're getting across and everything. But I struggled with the grandmother, so that's interesting that you had people, to me, effectively, it's interesting that you had so many people like her.
I don't know that they necessarily liked her as in they were warm to her, but more in that they enjoyed how brittle she was.
Fair enough. So I've got some kind of, I suppose you'd technically call them quickfire questions, although they're not really, but they're shorter. They're the interpretation questions. Does Esta survive?
Oh, am I allowed to answer that?
Yes. It's your opinion, so...
It's my opinion. I'm very much open to anyone having their own version of it. So if you are someone that believes Esta is alive, then that's absolutely fine by me. But I think my publicist has banned me from saying this, but in my version, Esta dies.
Fair enough. No, that's fascinating because I saw her as surviving.
Okay, I think a lot of people do, and that's maybe me being a pessimist and leaning more towards the darkness and the bleakness, as I said. But I think it's a more hopeful ending if she has survived. And I know my editor and I kept again disagreeing, and they were very much of the she survives angle, and my team is split quite 50-50 over whether she survives or whether she dies. But I love an open ending, and that's why I wanted to leave it that way so that people could read into it however they want. So if people believe that she survived, then I'm happy because it's open, and I'm more than happy for them to believe that was the ending.
No, I suppose I really do believe and want and hope her to survive, but at the same time, you say, death is more realistic, isn't it? Been looking forward to asking you that question for a while now.
I hope I haven't crushed your dreams or anything.
No. You've just provided me more to think about, because this is a novel that's left me thinking so much, so I love it. In your opinion, what's happened to Cal? Is he all right?
I think Cal's okay. I know some people have said to me, well, what about Cal? Like, why hasn't he saved Esta? And I just think it's one of those things. Cal knows the risk of going back there, and even more so now that they're aware of his existence and aware what Esta's done. I don't think he would do anything lightly. I don't think he would stay away on purpose as such. But I think realistically, he knows if he goes back, he's a dead man. So it's hard, isn't it? Because I do see Esta dying as the ending, but I know a lot of people would be rooting for that happy ending. And as I said, if you want to go for the happy ending, that's fine by me.
I mean, it's still a positive ending in that we've got people on the island that are starting to see the truth. So
that is my hope, because for me, that is the bigger picture. And that's what I was hoping to get across, is this idea that it's the start of change, and it's the start of an uprising. And we all know that regimes don't fall overnight, and it's just the hope that something will change. And particularly as Esta's untethering breaks all the rules, it is a sign that, Father Jesper is erratic, and he is losing control, and more women in the kind of crowd are seeing his true colours. So I'm hoping that readers will be left feeling that, this is the end of Eden's Isle, really.
So one more of this type of question, and someone we haven't really talked about, but I think we can do this, and there's still things to discover anyway. Esta's mother, is she okay?
She is. I mean, this is another bit of hope, because I truly believe that Esta's mother had her happy ending. So obviously we don't find out either way, but I hope that the hopeful readers who are discovering this book will believe that she did survive, because that's the way I see it.
Okay, well, we'll leave it there, because so much to talk about on this. I love it. In terms of your writing and books, what is next?
Well, I've started another novel. It shares kind of some similar themes, explores witchcraft, and there's a kind of cultish element to it as well, but it's quite a different book. So at the moment, as I said, it's very early days, so I've only just started it. But at the moment, I'm looking at a novel which, to me, one of my comparisons would be The Basrock by Evie Wilde. I don't know whether you've read it, but it's an amazing book. And so my novel is exploring 3 women in 3 different time periods who are all connected by the same house. One woman is a woman who is convicted of witchcraft in the 16th century. One woman is a woman who has postnatal depression and leaves her family to join a commune in the 1960s. And there's a woman in the present day who is kind of obsessed with the secrets of this house and a bit true crime obsessed. And she goes on a sort of discovery quest after the death of her mother and discovers that the secrets of the house are more closely linked to her life than she realized. So yes, it's very early stages, but I'm hoping that it's going to go somewhere and I'm going to finish it and it's going to be great, hopefully.
Sounds wowsy from here, definitely. So I've mentioned it earlier and we discussed something from it effectively. Can you tell us, you've got your own podcast, Confessions of a Debut Novelist. Tell us about it.
Yes, so it was an idea that kind of came at 5 a.m. in the morning and I woke up with it. I've loved podcasts for a long time and I'm a bit of a podcast obsessive, really. And I'd always wanted to do a podcast, but I'd never really had that idea of what to do a podcast about. And through writing this novel, I've found a great bunch of people who are all debuts in this year. And we've got various kind of Twitter groups and Facebook groups, and we meet up once a month to have a chat about how everything's going. And I'd had a meeting with my publishing team, and we were just talking this was back in November, about what things we were going to be doing for my book and what publicity we were going to be doing. And I left the meeting feeling so charged and invigorated and positive about everything. And I felt so enthusiastic about talking about my book and everyone else's book and the book world in general. And I just thought, oh, wouldn't it be great to interview everyone about their writing journey and how they got a book deal and how they write. And I always hope as well, when I interview fellow writers, that one day someone's going to give me a piece of advice that's going to make writing so much easier for me. But of course, that never happens because everyone has a completely different process. And I'm really nosy. I love hearing about how people write, what their process is, where they get their ideas. And also, I think there are so many ways of getting an agent and getting a book deal. And I know that when I was just starting out on writing, I had absolutely no clue how to get a book deal or get an agent. And I think it's fascinating to hear all the different stories and rejections. Writing is a very lonely thing and a very solitary thing. And it's always nice to know there are other people going through the same thing as you. And I absolutely love doing the podcast. I'm sure you love doing yours as well. So it's a great thing to do.
There's a definite specific pleasure in it, effectively. And you just learn
definitely.
so much from other people, definitely. But yes, that is Confessions of a Debut Novelist, listeners, and there will be links in the episode description. Do go and check it out. It's great. She's got one with Melissa Fu, who you will know I had as well. I really enjoyed that episode. Chloe, is there anything else that we maybe haven't covered or we have covered but not in enough detail, etc., that you would like to add to the end of this podcast?
Oh my goodness, I think we've covered so much. You've really kind of racked my brain for every last bit of detail in the terms of the story and the world building. I had to go back, 4 years, 5 years back into my planning and many, many drafts to give you the answers. But it's been so nice to delve deep, and it's strange that it's something that's only existed in my head, and it's very nice to be able to talk about it in detail to someone that's read it and has their own theories and ideas. And I think what's so nice about writing a book like mine is that it does have its own world and can be interpreted in different ways, and people have their own ideas of characters and where they're going to end up or how they've ended up. And it's been such a pleasure to talk about it with you.
Thank you. And I have racked your brains. That's a good point. I know that I've got lots of questions and I want details. That's kind of me all over, I suppose, when it comes to books. So, Chloe, this has been amazing having you. I saw your book on Twitter, I think it was, liked the look of it, and then I started reading it and thought, my goodness, this is one of the best decisions I've ever made, with thinking, oh, it looks nice and let's go for it. It has been an absolute pleasure reading your book. I'm kind of upset that it's over. And it's been lovely having you today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Charlie. You've made my day with your lovely comments, and it's been so nice to delve deep into the world of the Seawomen.
Links to purchase the Seawomen are in the episode description. If you have enjoyed today's discussion, do subscribe or follow the podcast on your listening app of choice. And please do review the podcast if you can. Reviews are incredibly valuable, both in getting the word out there and also in terms of feedback. Reviews can be left on Apple Podcasts, Podcast Addict, and the Podchaser website. The Wormhole Podcast episode 64 was recorded on the 7th of June and published on the 11th of July 2022. Music and production by Charlie Place.